The Tuskegee Experiment began in 1932. At the time, there was no known treatment for syphilis, a contagious disease. After being recruited by the promise of free health care, 600 African Americans in Macon County, Alabama, were enrolled in a program which aimed in the study of the full progression of disease. The project was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service from 1932 to 1972, examination the natural course of untreated syphilis in African men. The research was intended to test whether syphilis caused a cardiovascular damage more often than neurological damage, to determine if the natural course of syphilis in black men was different from that of white men. In order to recruit participants, the Public Health Service enlisted the support of the prestigious Tuskegee Institute in Macon County, Alabama. A group of 399 affected patients and 201 uninfected control patients were recruited to the program. The subjects were in black impoverished sharecroppers from Macon County, and the original study was only scheduled to last 6 to 9 months, but it was extended for 40 years. Welcome to One Mic. I'm your host, Country Boy, and as I've said, this episode is about the Tuskegee Experiment. As always, if you like this, please consider donating to our Patreon page. Visit us at onemichistory.com. Give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. And without further ado, get started. The Tuskegee Experiment had nothing to do with treatment. No drug was tested, neither was an effort made to establish the efficacy of old forms of treatment. It was completely a non-therapeutic experiment aimed at compiling data on the effects of the evolution of syphilis in black males. It was done with complete disregard for the risks taken with the lives of the subjects. But to understand those risks taken, we need to understand the disease and have some historical context of African Americans and the medical community. Syphilis is a highly contagious disease that is either acquired or congenital. The disease enters the body through the skin or the mucous membrane, usually during sexual intercourse. Congenital syphilis is transmitted to the fetus through the affected mother. There are 3 stages of development for the disease: primary, secondary, and tertiary. The primary stage lasts around 10 to 60 days from the time of infection and is usually encompassed with a round ulcer that may go unnoticed. It will heal without treatment within a month or two, lest it becomes secondary infected. Once the second stage begins, within 6 weeks to 6 months, it's accompanied with a rash resembling measles or chickenpox. Once again, it may be mild and may go unnoticed, but the bones and joints will often be very painful, along with fever, indigestion, headaches, and other symptoms may accompany the rash. During the secondary stage, this is the most widespread proliferation of the disease throughout the body. The secondary syphilis gives way in most cases without treatment to a period of latency that may last a few weeks or up to 30 years. All symptoms of the disease will disappear, but the disease will not vanish. Once latent, it will bore into the bone marrow, lymph nodes, and vital organs, and the central nervous system of its victims. In some cases, it seems to follow some coexistence with the host, and they may go on to live long, healthy lives. But for most, the latency period only lasts 2 to 3 years, and then the appearance of all the symptoms of the final tertiary stage. During late stage syphilis, gummy tumors will appear on the body. The disease assaults the bone structure and produces deterioration resembling bone tuberculosis. Sometimes the tumor will be absorbed by the bone structure or may cause destruction of the bone. The liver may also be attacked, resulting in scarring and deformation of the organ. The greatest damage is saved for the cardiovascular and central nervous system. Tumors may attack the walls of the heart or the blood vessels, and when the aorta is involved, the walls may become weakened and scar tissue may form over the lesion. The stretching of the vessel walls may produce an aneurysm, resulting in almost sudden death. The results on the brain are almost equally devastating as it spreads to the brain through the blood vessels. The disease can take several forms, best known as the paresis, general softening of the brain, which may produce progressive paralysis and insanity. Other forms of neurosyphilis may produce a stumbling, foot-slapping gait of its victims due to destruction of the neural cells in the spinal cord. Syphilis is also known to attack the the optical nerves, causing blindness, or the eighth cranial nerve, inflicting deafness. All effects of this damage is permanent. Causes of syphilis and late stages of disease, its development, complications from untreated syphilis were all known to medicine in 1932 when the Tuskegee Experiment began study, but the medical community felt that blacks were prone to sexually transmitted diseases and couldn't be convinced to seek treatment for syphilis, so the Public Health Association created this study as a study of nature rather than an experiment. Was meant to observe the progression of syphilis within a community that wouldn't get treatment anyway. All of this was rooted in scientific racism that dates back to the early dates of the slave trade. As early as 1600s, but really started to take off in the 19th century, the cultural and medical landscape in the United States was built upon racist concepts. Scientific racism was common, and many whites already thought themselves superior to blacks, and the scientific and medical community was one too happy to reinforce that hierarchy. Physicians felt that the health of blacks had to be considered separate from the health of whites, and physicians, of course, didn't dissent against white society's belief in the physical and mental inferiority of blacks, and they actually did a great deal to bolster and reaffirm racial attitudes by focusing on ways that black people appear to be different from whites, like the hair color, the facial features, their posture, the gait, odor, and skin color. Most physicians who wrote about blacks during this time were Southerners who reinforced the idea of slavery and second-class citizenship in blacks. So physicians insisted that blacks were incapable of assuming a higher station in life, using pseudoscientific medicine as a rationale for keeping blacks in their place within the social hierarchy. Physicians like Dr. Josiah Clark Knott and Dr. Samuel A. Cartwright were vicious advocates for blacks' inferiority, in writing a large number of articles during the 1840s and 1850s on diseases and the physical properties that seemed to be only particular to blacks. Some of these diseases were dirt eating and Negro consumption. Slave owners would even ask these physicians to write manuals on how to treat slaves, but the physicians could only write about how blacks were medically inferior to whites without offering any medical explanation or a form of treatment. Advocates for racial medicine would use malaria in blacks as a case in point. In many instances, African Americans did appear to be less susceptible to disease and seemed to suffer milder illness when they did contract it. But physicians would extrapolate from those individual cases and use it to reinforce slavery, arguing that blacks were relatively immune to malaria, thus were better suited for working in rice fields and cane plantation. Medical views of blacks were even used to answer abolitionists. Scientists argued that African men were uniquely fitted for enslavement due to their physical strength and simple minds. They argued that slaves possessed a primitive nervous system and did not experience pain the same way white people did. They also insisted that enslaved African Americans in the South suffered mental and physical illness at a lower rate than their free northern counterparts, and that blacks could not survive without close supervision and constant medical attention, citing that free blacks in the North had high instances of medical and physical illness accompanied by a declining birth rate. Before the ending of slavery, scientific racism was even used to justify the entire slave trade. Scientific and medical authorities in the late 19th, early 20th century held extremely harmful pseudoscience ideas specifically about the sex drive and genitalia of African Americans. It was widely believed that the brains of African Americans were under-evolved, but their genitalia was overdeveloped. Black men seemed to have an intrinsic perversion to white women, and that all African Americans were seen as inherently immoral with insatiable sexual appetites. And to the extent in which physicians attributed incidents of syphilis among blacks to physical inferiority, sexual promiscuity that they believed to be intrinsic to the black race. The black population in Macon County, Alabama, was mostly rural sharecroppers who were poor and or illiterate. Because of this, it was very unlikely that they could afford to pay for proper health care. Many of them made less than $1 a day, and most doctors at the time charged $1 per mile just to come out. Most were reduced to treating themselves using home remedies and consulting physicians only during emergencies. Poor black sharecroppers simply had to endure chronic diseases like syphilis, and estimates at the time put the infection rate of syphilis in the black community in Macon County as high as 35%. State authorities in Alabama admitted that the syphilis program simply did not reach rural blacks in Macon County, and that Macon County did not even have a health department until 1928. So health officials in Macon County responded enthusiastically when the Surgeon General announced the syphilis control program, and state authorities agreed to sponsor Macon County as a demonstration site in January of 1930. Macon County was selected for various reasons. Tuskegee Institute had endorsed the program, promising assistance, and Macon County Board of Health and Macon County health officials and several large black employers offered active cooperation in the project. The original study was funded by the Rosenwald Fund and the state of Alabama to create and gather and attempt to control syphilis in the rural black population in the county. From the beginning of the study, deception was intrinsic to the study. Low turnout to the syphilis control program in the beginning caused the health officials to announce that they would begin testing for bad blood. Knowing that bad blood meant different things to different people among rural blacks, health officials embraced this confusion by using terms like syphilis and bad blood interchangeably. Treatments for bad blood were expected to cure headaches, indigestion, pellagra, and sterility. Bad blood was a very broad term within the black community, and this was used ideally for the health department to convince poor blacks to come in and get tested. Black sharecropper Charles Pollard will recall that in 1932, some men came by and told him that he would receive free physical examination if he appeared the next day at one of the nearby schoolrooms. He went in and they were told that I had bad blood. An official with the CDC stated that bad blood was a synonym for syphilis in the black community. And apparently this was new to the participants of the study, because Pollard would state that that could be true, but he had never heard such a thing. After the Rosenwald Fund withdrew the support of the syphilis control demonstration, the final report from the syphilis control demonstration provoked an idea for a new study, an idea that evolved into the Tuskegee study for untreated syphilis in Negro males. The idea was originated from Dr. Tafaro Clark. After reading the report, he stated that it came to me that Alabama offered an unparalleled opportunity for study of the effects of untreated syphilis. Due to the high prevalence rate in the county and unlikeliness, syphilitic blacks will receive treatment. Macon County offered a unique medical facilities like John A. Andrew Memorial Hospital at Tuskegee Institute. The bottom line was that Macon County offered thousands of affected blacks who lived outside of modern medicine, yet close enough to well-equipped teaching hospitals that could double as scientific laboratories. Dr. Clark wanted to salvage value from the now-defunct treatment program. While medical scientists did know a great deal about syphilis, he felt that there was merit in learning more about the disease, specifically in African Americans. Until that point, medical science had not produced a single study proving that syphilis affected blacks any differently from whites. Dr. Clark felt like the fate of syphilitic blacks in Macon County was sealed regardless of the future of the experiment. In the beginning, Clark didn't intend that anyone would be denied treatment on a long-term basis. The experiment was only supposed to last 6 months to a year, and Dr. Clark felt that a full treatment program would require more than a year to complete. It took less than a month to make the necessary arrangements. One by one, the Alabama Board of Health, the Tuskegee Institute, the Macon County Board of Health all agreed to cooperate. It was at this point that Dr. Clark selected his clinical team. Dr. Raymond Von Leer was in charge of the field work, and joining Von Leer was a black nurse by the name of Eunice Rivers. She was selected to serve as a special scientific assistant. Thus, the study of untreated syphilis in blacks was. Public Health Service clinicians proposed using black schools and churches in Macon County to assemble an audience and announce that government doctors were returning to give free blood tests. Nurse Rivers would comment they were overflooded with people coming in to get their blood drawn, and they took advantage of the opportunity to get health for a host of medical problems. By the end of 2 months, they collected almost 6,000 blood samples, and Dr. Von Leer wrote Dr. Clark stating that the success of the study depended depended on persuading the men to come in for physical examinations. So the Public Health Service offered men incentive to participate, like free physical examinations, free rides to the clinics, and hot meals on exam days, along with free treatment for minor ailments. Dr. Von Leer felt like the study was burdened by treatment. They were obligated by the agreement with state officials to provide a minimum program for therapy for the syphilitic cases they diagnosed. Dr. Von Leer warned Dr. Clark that they were treating 500 patients a week, and the number that he felt like would not likely to reduce until the study had ended and all treatment had stopped. All the men in the study received treatment, but the quantity and form depended on the patient that was examined and the drugs that happened to be on hand at the time. As a result, people got treated with whatever was available rather than a balanced program, neophysamin and mercury, that the therapy demanded. As a result, Dr. Von Leer did a spot check, and only 3% of the men in the study had positive test results on their blood tests, and even the ineffective treatment was expensive. So they decided to stop monitoring the effects of the limited treatment that they had been giving, and Dr. Von Leer put all his energy in compiling data. Dr. Von Leer argued that the men could be considered untreated because they had received far less treatment than the standards of modern medicine prescribed. The study appeared to be ending after a year as originally planned, and would have if not for important personnel changes. Dr. Clark retired in June 1933, and Dr. Von Leer succeeded him as the acting director and director of the Division of Venereal Diseases. This promotion and subsequent policy hires set in motion a pattern of bureaucracy that ensured that the experiment's longevity for the next 4 decades. Once he assumed office, there was never any doubt that Dr. Von Leer would continue the experiment. He was completely convinced that the experiment had scientific merit. The irony of this is the experiment was contaminated by the treatment of the men in the study. Thus, this study of untreated syphilis in black males had no actual scientific merit. During the summer of 1933, when it seemed as if the experiment was about to end, it was now given a new open-ended life. Dr. Von Leer decided that the proper way to continue the observation was to eventually bring the black men back for autopsy. He knew that autopsy would create great uncertainty about how long the experiment would last, and because he had only planned to send health officers to Tuskegee once a year, Dr. Von Leer would assign a great deal of importance to the nurse's role. Nurse Rivers was his first choice for the job because she had already had contact with most of the men due to her prominence in the first study. Dr. Von Leer would return to Alabama in November of 1933 to confer with medical societies in the area. In the meeting with local physicians, they were conducted a mini seminar on the experiment. Treatment was not discussed, but everyone in those meetings understood the purpose of the experiment was to study untreated syphilis, and it was understood by everyone that they would not treat these men. Securing the approval of the local physicians was important because the Public Health Service needed their help. Dr. Von Leer wanted them to serve as a conduit by funneling subjects to the autopsy table. Knowing that the men would only seek medical assistance when they became critically ill, he felt the success of the experiment was studying them while they were dying. With the help of the physicians, Dr. Von Leer distributed a complete list of the subjects and requested that physicians check the names against their black patients and refer the men to Nurse Rivers. Unless they were terminally ill, then they should be sent to Andrews Hospital, where they would die and autopsies would be performed. With each supporting physician was meant to shut another door of treatment and reduce the possibility that these men would obtain medical care. As news of government doctors returning, men from the syphilitic group began appearing at Andrews Hospital. They remained untreated, but the doctors started giving them small quantities of aspirin tablets. The aspirin was an instant hit for the men, and they marveled how it relieved their aches and pains. And from then on, government doctors routinely dispensed little bottles of pink medicine, as they call it, every time they examined those men. This had allowed them to convince the men that they were being treated for bad blood when the effects were only temporary. In 1935, the Public Health Service began offering burial stipends in exchange for permission to perform autopsies. autopsies. Dr. Von Leer felt like that the burial stipend was an excellent means to entice families to allow autopsies on their family members. The Public Health Service offered each family $50 each, and for poor farmers, it was a godsend because otherwise they would not be able to afford a decent funeral. Nurse Rivers' interest in the families did not end with the autopsies. She attended every funeral service and often sat with the relatives of the deceased. She felt like she was a part of their family, and part of the success of the study was in large part to her rapport with the family and her relationship. And because the relationship was so close, and if contact was broken, autopsies might be lost. Her contact with the men allowed her to have eyes and ears everywhere because the men contacted her not only about themselves, but about other men in the experiment. The relationship that evolved between Nurse Rivers and the men played an important role in keeping them in the experiment. More than any other person, she made them believe that they were receiving actual medical care and that she was actually helping them. Nurse Rivers' ability to recognize the men on site helped the Public Health Service prevent them from getting actual treatment. In the early years of the experiment, there was no real danger that the men would receive medical care, but in 1937, the Rosenwald Fund decided to renew its support of the syphilis control program. Feeling that treatment might actively endanger the experiment, Dr. Von Leer arranged to have Nurse Rivers assigned to Dr. B. Perry, as he was the doctor for the syphilis control program in Macon County, and she was able to convince Perry to cooperate with the experiment, and her presence in the clinics no doubt guaranteed that the men in the experiment would not be treated. Later, in 1939, Dr. Reginald G. James worked with the Public Health Service in Macon County, specifically diagnosing and treating syphilis. Also assigned to work with Nurse Rivers, James recalled that she would say, "He's understudy, he's not to be treated," and participants in the program later would state that Nurse Rivers prevented them from receiving medical care at the rapid treatment programs that were introduced by the Public Health Service in the early 1940s. Nurse Rivers was not troubled by the ethics of the experiment. She saw herself as a great nurse. She did as the doctor ordered. She did not advocate for treatment for the men because, as she explained, as a nurse, I didn't feel like it was my responsibility. It was the doctor. As a nurse being trained, when I was being trained, we were taught that we never diagnosed, we never prescribed, we just followed the doctor's instructions. Even when penicillin became widely available in the 40s, Nurse Rivers didn't give it a second thought. By that time, almost a decade had passed since the men had been in the study, and not giving treatment would have become routine. In 1938, Dr. Von Leer, feeling that he needed to devote more attention to the study, so he selected Dr. Austin V. Delbert to take charge. Once Delbert began examination, he was shocked to discover that the untreated syphilitic subjects had actually received some treatment. He wrote Dr. Von Leer and demanded to know why the study for untreated syphilitic patients was being conducted on men who had actually received treatment. Dr. Von Leer stated that the men in the experiment had been treated, but that it was unavoidable. Delbert would go on to ignore all the men had received treatment and the ethical issues with the study, and would later confess that the group struck his investigative fancy and he planned to use the men in the experiment to recruit subjects to the study. Although there were talks of bringing in new subjects to the syphilitic group, no new subjects were added after 1939. During World War II, the war created a situation in which the military wanted to make certain that syphilitic men in Macon County got treated. Approximately 250 of the subjects in the study were under 45 in 1941 and were registered A1 registrants. Once the physical examination was conducted into the armed services revealed syphilis, the men started getting letters from their local draft boards ordering some of the men in the study to get treatment. But in 1942, the U.S. Public Health Service explained to the chairman of the local draft board that most of the men were already over 35 and would probably not be called in active duty. So the members of the draft board agreed to exclude the men from the study from their list of draftees needing treatment, thereby blocking their enlistment and their therapy. In 1943, the Henderson Act was passed, requiring tests and treatment for venereal diseases to be publicly funded. This should have ended the experiment, but as the men in the study who had been exempt from earlier treatment, the Henderson Act was never applied to them. Meanwhile, in 1943, Dr. Heller succeeded Dr. Von Leer as the director of the Division of the Venereal Diseases, and the Public Health Service started to administer penicillin to syphilitic patients in rabid treatment centers all over the country. If Dr. Heller wished to end the experiment by giving the men penicillin, he could have done so. Health officials who inherited the study just kept with the status quo, and the experiment never received a fresh review. Even though no one knew the exact number of subjects, the records were incomplete, attendance had fallen off at annual roundups, and numerous subjects could not be accounted for. The experiment was eventually reviewed in 1951, but health officials limited the scope and didn't review the complete study from 1932. They only looked to review how many in the group of untreated syphilitics had since received antibiotics. Predictably, the health officials convinced themselves that the experiment should go forward, and they simply ignored the ethical issues and a host of other issues and continued moving forward. Health officials simply assumed that the study would continue until the last subject had died. And the study would go on unchecked for another decade. Even the civil rights movement did nothing to change their enthusiasm for the study. That was until Peter Buxton was hired by the Public Health Service in 1965 to interview patients with sexually transmitted diseases. He learned of the Tuskegee Experiment from co-workers and later said that, "I didn't want to believe it. This was the Public Health Service. We didn't do things like that." Alarmed by the similarities of the Tuskegee Experiment and crimes in the 1947 Nuremberg trial, Buxton wrote comparing the Knox experiment to the Tuskegee Experiment, stating that syphilitic damage in which these men were allowed to endure. His immediate superiors were not pleased and responded by, "I'll send your report up the line, but remember, you have a wife and kids, and please forget my name when they ask you why you did this." Another one of his supervisors called the report trash, insulting, and the men were all volunteers. Somehow, the U.S. Public Health Service didn't see the comparison between the Nuremberg Code and their own research, and were assumed they were insulated from informed consent procedures widely adopted in the 1960s. After dispatching his critique to headquarters, Buxton was flown to Alabama to confer with USPHS doctors. They defended the use of the Tuskegee volunteers, and Buxton countered the saying that they were no more than dupes being used as human guinea pigs. One doctor was so infuriated and thought of me as some sort of lunatic and needed chastisement and proceeded to administer it. Doctors enthusiastically praised the study's value for physicians, and Buxton attempted to advocate for the rights of the experiment's victims, expecting to be fired because the bomb dropped in their laps. Instead, nothing happened. A year later, he left the PHS to attend law school. Haunted by the plight of the subject's victims, Buxton challenged the USPHS in 1968, writing that the men were quite ignorant to the effects of untreated syphilis, and further, the group was 100% Negro, and in itself, this was political dynamite. With race riots exploding all over the country, the USPHS convened a blue ribbon panel of physicians. Although the death rate among affected men was 23% higher than the control group, doctors were more worried about the side effects of treatment and the unfulfilled debt to the subjects who had already suffered and died. 7 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King, ironically citing the political volatility of the study, they voted to continue without treatment or informed consent of the subjects. Dismayed, Buxton responded that the men would no longer exercise the choice of ending their days free of syphilis. He urged the USPHS to provide compensation rather than await the quiet demise of the survivors and hope that the matter. In 1972, Buxton leaked information of the Tuskegee Experiment to Gene Heller of the Associated Press. Heller did a bit of digging and uncovered additional medical articles about the experiment and reached out to an official at the CDC. She received a straightforward, matter-of-fact answer, as if the health officials felt like they had nothing to hide. The PHS was very true to their goal and was still conducting the study when Heller broke the story in July 25th in Washington Star. The CDC attempted to explain the study by stating that the study began when attitudes toward human experimentation was very different and that the treatment was much worse than the disease. They attempted to maintain that the men were now beyond medical help, thus implying that no real harm had been done by continuing the study for the next 4 40 years. The federal government would move forward with an investigation on the study in August of 1972, and a panel for the investigation ruled the study should be terminated immediately, and the men within the study should receive the care required for the treatment of any disabilities resulting from their participation. And later, in April 1973, the panel's first report was highly critical of the study, stating that the decision rested on the government's failure to obtain informed consent of the participants in the study of a disease with a known risk to human life. The panel unequivocally stated that penicillin therapy should have been given to the patients at least by 1953, when penicillin had become generally available, and they strongly implied the treatment of arsenal and mercury should have been administered much earlier. In December of 1973, the government agreed to pay approximately $10 million in an out-of-court settlement. Each planner will receive $37,500 for every living member of the study, and $15,000 to the heirs of each deceased member. In 1997, President Bill Clinton issued an apology stating that the United States government did something that was very wrong, deeply, profoundly, and morally wrong. And it's not only in remembering the shame is that we make amends and attempt to repair our nation, but in remembering the past that we can build a better present and a better future. Thank you. This has been One Mike. I'm your host, Country Boy, and this was the Tuskegee Experiment. As always, if you like this, if you love this, please visit me at onemikehistory.com. Please consider donating to our Patreon page. Please subscribe to my podcast and give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Peace.